But obviously I'm standing for the mayoral candidate, and in Leicester we have this elected city mayor who is all-powerful and really can dictate to the council what happens. For example, if the mayor puts forward a budget, it needs 2/3 of the councillors to vote against it in order to stop it from going through. So that gives you an indication of the sort of power that's concentrated into the hands of the mayor. And I think ex-councillors like Wayne here will tell me most councillors are left totally in the dark as to what's really going on the council. For example, in terms of the finances of the council and all the rest of it. And we opposed the idea of a city mayor to start with. We think that having a collective council is much more democratic because, for example, if a library or a youth club in your area is being closed, you can go and lobby your local councillor. You can tell them that if they don't fight to save that local resource, then they could lose in the next election locally. It's much harder to lobby a more remote city mayor. And in fact, we said that it was a move towards the more American system, where effectively councils in the end barely exist, that the mayor has a relationship with business and the work of the council is handed out to different companies, and that the council meets once a year to approve the contracts of who's going to do all the work of the council. And it's part of a process, really, of the destruction of local democracy, because the figures that Caroline gave at the beginning about the cuts that have been made to local government as part of the government's wider austerity are absolutely drastic. In the council's budget figures, in the next 2 years, but the 10 years up to in 2 years' time, whatever year we're in now, in 2021, in the 10 years up to 2021, council services in Leicester will have been cut by 62% if you exclude social care. 62%! And a council provides a huge range of services that people rely on. I mean, it's amazing that any services are left at the moment. But those cuts are going to continue. And if you look around the country, councils like Tory Northamptonshire have already reached the point of bankruptcy. And in fact, that council is going to be split up and effectively abolished by the government. This is a major crisis of our services, to go alongside the major crisis in education, in health, and all of the other services that are provided in public. And it's part of the austerity programme of the Tories, which we have to fight. Our argument, and the main difference between us and all the other parties in the election, is that at the end of the day, they accept the cuts, and we don't accept those cuts. In some cases, they say the cuts are terrible, but what can we do? We'll just have to carry out and manage them. That's the position of Pete Soulsby, and that's the position of the local Labour council. They might say, we hope that when Jeremy Corbyn gets elected, he will reverse those cuts. And of course, I agree. We didn't stand in the general election against Jeremy Corbyn because we wanted to see a Labour government, we wanted to see the end of the Tories, and we wanted to see not just any Labour government, but one led by Jeremy Corbyn, who said he was going to oppose austerity. But at the local level, it's not the same at all. Because at the local level, you've got a council run in the Blairite manner, if you like, managing capitalism, managing the cuts, and so on. The Tories, of course, have had some debates in the last few weeks with some of their mayoral candidates. Been interesting. In some debates, particularly the ones organised by trade unions, then only the Greens and the Socialists turn up. None of the main parties have turned up. The Trades Union Council, which represents all the trade unions in Leicester, had a debate, and Soulsby was coming and let them know an hour beforehand that he wasn't going to turn up, didn't send a representative. The Tories and Liberals didn't even reply. And in the Unison debate, the Unison had to cancel it because in the end it was just going to be me and the Green turning up to that one. I would have been quite happy for them not to cancel it, because I think it was important for anyone who's standing for council to have a dialogue with the council's own workforce and the unions that represent the council's own workforce. But there have been some debates, and at one debate, the Tory candidate for mayor has got to be the biggest hypocrite I've met for a very long time, because she talks about, oh, we've got to put money into youth services, we've got to put money into libraries, we've got to put money into this, and she blames it all on Salisbury. Now, I agree that there are projects that Salisbury has concentrated on, and there are things like donating 11 million to Travelodge, who is now denying that he's ever done that, by the way, but when you dig into it, it's sleight of hand. But the main reason for the crisis is the Tory government's cuts. So for the Tory to say, oh, I'm going to put money into this, she's just a barefaced liar, as a matter of fact. The Liberals, interestingly, the Liberal candidate at the last debate said the reason the government didn't have any money is because Labour spent it all when they were in power. You know, this story about someone left a note, the money's all gone, or whatever it was. This totally ignores the fact that the reason that these governments have said they've had to make cuts is the economic crash of 2008, the banking collapse and the recession that resulted from that. But what we said at the time is the reason for that collapse is not this or that government. We don't agree with what the Blairite Labour government was doing, but it's capitalism. Actually, it's the system that caused that crisis. That's why every single government in the world run by capitalists did the same thing. And we said at the time, what will happen is there's a crisis of the bossy system, and the people who will pay for that crisis will be us. They'll be ordinary people, working class people. What happened? The banks were bailed out to the tune of trillions of pounds, and they then embarked on making us pay. And part of that was holding down wages and living standards. There's been the biggest recession in wages and living standards in this country for 200 years in relative terms, since 2008, and also in terms of our public services. So it's the system that caused that crisis in the first place. But then the response to that was from Labour and Tory and Liberals, all of them at a national level, this is pre-Jeremy Corbyn, was to say we have to solve this problem by cutting spending, tightening our belts and making working class people pay. And that hasn't solved any of the problems either, because we've not got back to the situation even now that we were in before 2007 in terms of living standards, in terms of public services and everything else. So actually we would argue it needs a socialist solution, and if there's time we'll come back onto that in a minute. So why aren't I talking about local politics? Because they link. They absolutely link. The cuts are the result of national government policy, but what do we do about it? As I said before, if we don't fight, we'll have no services left at all. So what the Socialist Party is proposing is, as Sophia said, is to resist it, is to set a no-cuts budget, to use the money that does exist in the reserves at this moment in time. The first debate that I was at that Salisbury attended, he denied it. The second debate, for some reason, he didn't even bother denying it. But they do have hundreds of millions, or over 100 million, in the bank in what's called earmarked reserves, and that's separate from ring-fenced reserves. I know this seems like semantics, but it's important because ring-fenced reserves are legally restricted to certain items that you can spend them on, right? Earmarked reserves are just things in the reserves that the mayor has decided he will save for a specific purpose. Nothing legally restrained about that money at all. The mayor can create an earmarked reserve and the mayor can dissolve an earmarked reserve. That's a fact. And therefore that money could be used to stop cuts from taking place. But as Sophia said, clearly, if you've got money in the bank, even if it's over £100 million, it couldn't last forever. The point about that is that it gives you time to go to people in Leicester whose services are threatened, to go to workers on the council whose jobs and terms and conditions are threatened, and say to them, if you back us in setting a no-cuts budget, we need you to be involved in a campaign to force the money from the government. Now, is that possible? Well, I think we proved by our own record as the Socialist Party, involved in campaigns like the Save Glenfield Children's Heart Centre campaign, of which I was the chair, that if you mobilise people, if you get thousands of people on the streets, if you get people involved in action, then that is a powerful force. We forced the NHS nationally and the government behind them and the politicians to do a U-turn about the Glenfield Children's Heart Centre. If we can do that over that, then we can do that over council cuts, especially when we have a government that is on the ropes, as it is at the present time. It's a minority government that hasn't got the support of its own MPs, that could collapse because of Brexit at any moment. It's really, a good kick could force it out. And if councils like Leicester, Labour-led councils at the moment, were prepared to lead that kind of fight, and they linked up across the country, that would be a huge force that could have an impact on pushing the government out of office and getting money out of the government that we need. So that's the difference in us and the other parties, is a fight. The Green Party agree with a lot of what we say, and we agree with many of their policies. But they still have the problem, is that because they stay within the framework of the system, they think they can improve things little by little, and no need for any fundamental real change in terms of the way the economic system works, then they are restricted in what they're prepared to do. And as Tom raised at the Trades Council debate, when the Greens were actually running a council in Brighton, they ended up making cuts. They weren't prepared to lead that fight. Now, the Green Party representative said, they split, and half the councillors supported the idea of a no-cuts budget and half didn't. But that also reflects the character of the Green Party, doesn't it? That it is a mixed bunch, some of whom are socialists and some of whom are very pro-capitalist, and where there's no real discipline or control over what councils do. We need a movement where people have control over their representatives. That's why we support building that kind of a movement. That's why we support having representatives that are on the average wage of a worker. That's why we've said that if I was elected, I wouldn't take the £70,000 a year plus that the mayor is paid for being a mayor, excluding other sources of income that he might have, that I would live on the average wage of a worker in Leicester, which apparently is £23,000. By the way, that would be a big pay rise for me.